Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get into the story. The life of Emily Carter was not one built on accidents. From childhood, she had been drawn to the edges of maps, to the blank places where roads stopped and curiosity began. Born in Portland, Oregon, she grew up in a house where her father taught geology at a community college and her mother worked as a nurse. Family trips were less about amusement parks and more about hiking trails, abandoned mining towns, and nights spent under skies untouched by city light. Her early journals already carried the same disciplined tone that later defined her professional. Notes, precise descriptions of insects she collected in jars, sketches of leaves with annotated veins, lists of questions about why certain birds flew low before storms. In college, she studied environmental sciences but gravitated toward storytelling. By the time she graduated, Emily had found a hybrid career that kept her in motion. Part researcher, part documentarian, part freelance writer for science magazines that wanted adventure framed in a human voice. She was 32 when she began preparing for the journey that would become her last. By then, she had spent a decade documenting fragile ecosystems, caves in New Mexico, coastal swamps in Georgia, a high-altitude plateau in Chile where she wrote about lichens that grow slower than human lifetimes. She had also begun to chase rumors, not only facts. She understood that myths often grew from kernels of truth, and she liked peeling back layers until she found the human reality beneath the superstition. It was during a conference in Lima, where she presented her short film on rivers that vanish underground, that Emily first heard the phrase La Selva Prohibida spoken aloud. A Peruvian biologist, half amused and half uneasy, mentioned it during an after-dinner conversation. "There are places in Madre de Dios you do not go," he said, "not because of snakes or jaguars, though those are there too. You do not go because people have drawn a line. The jungle is not just trees, it is also rules, and one of those rules is simple. Do not step inside." He had laughed when he said it, but Emily noticed he did not look at her when he finished. Back in her hotel room that night, she wrote one line at the top of her notebook: "The Forbidden Jungle." Why forbidden, and to whom? The weight of local warnings. Why? The time Emily reached Puerto Maldonado months later, she had already read everything she could about the region. Most of it was sparse. Brief references in travel logs from the early 20th century, a handful of missionary journals that spoke vaguely of uncontacted souls, and more recent anthropological papers that carefully avoided speculation. What she did find repeated was a pattern. Expeditions that turned back early, maps that showed blank zones where rivers bent strangely, and offhand references to villages that don't want to be seen. But what struck her most were the voices of the locals. In the villages closest to the tree line, the warnings came with a matter-of-fact weight, not drama. A woman selling cassava bread told her, "You can walk to the river and back. You can fish and swim, but if you see the old markings, you turn around." No one who ignored them came home the same. A shopkeeper told her a story of his grandfather, who entered the Selva Prohibida with 2 other men during a dry season to hunt tapir. Only one returned, barefoot and unable to speak above a whisper for the rest of his life. He was not wounded, the shopkeeper said, just emptied. A local teacher, Rosa, whom Emily later recorded, was more direct. "It is not ghosts. People like to say ghosts because it is easier than saying the truth. The truth is that there are people who never wanted us there. They protect their own world. Maybe they are not many. Maybe they are more than we think. But the forbidden jungle is forbidden because they made it so." Emily listened. She wrote everything down, but her notes, even in the beginning, carried the trace of skepticism. In one margin she wrote, "Fear makes stories grow, but maybe stories are how fear explains what it already knows." The journalist's drive colleagues who knew Emily say this trip was typical of her instincts. She had built a reputation for chasing what others ignored. She wasn't reckless. She carried first aid kits, water filters, satellite trackers, but she believed deeply that stories lived at the edge of discomfort. Her editor, a woman named Karen Lee, later recalled, "Emily always said the same thing. If everyone is already telling the story, it's not worth my time." She wanted the story that didn't have a path yet. She wanted to go one step further, because that was where she believed. The truth waited. That was her flaw and her gift. So when she set her eyes on La Selva Prohibida, she wasn't thinking of danger in the cinematic sense. She was thinking of narrative. To her, the Forbidden Jungle wasn't just a patch of trees. It was a puzzle, a story that had been left untold because people were too afraid or too respectful to touch it. Emily wanted to touch it. And that is how, by late June, she found herself standing on a gravel bank at sunrise, staring at the wall. Of green, her pack strapped tight, her notebook already open to a fresh page. Emily left the last edge of the river with a calmness that surprised even herself. The pilot of the small canoe, a cousin of her fixer, Julio, had looked at her with a face that gave nothing away when she stepped onto the bank. He did not offer advice, and she did not ask for any. Their agreement was clear. 3 days in, return. To the same bend, signal if she arrived early. When she waved, he would bring the boat again. She shouldered her pack and disappeared into the green curtain that closed behind her within minutes. Her first voice note that day carried no tension. She described the ground as firm, damp in patches but workable. She said the canopy was high, enough to keep the sun from punishing her, and that the forest felt structured, like a cathedral. Her words were analytical, even reverent. She noted the calls of macaws above and the hum of insects below, marking frequencies as if cataloging an orchestra. By afternoon, her tone had shifted. In another note, she paused mid-sentence, then said, "I keep thinking I hear someone walking just behind me. When I stop, it stops. When I move, it follows. It could just be echo in the understory. It could be nothing, but I'll mark this in case it repeats." She laughed lightly at herself and added, "Don't dramatize, Emily." She began using strips of bright orange tape to mark her path. The photos recovered later showed them tied to vines, saplings, even stones stacked carefully. But not all of them were hers. 2 markers were found tied with knots she never used, tighter and more deliberate, as if someone had been echoing her method with their own. On the second night, she set her tent on a ridge above a stream that wound like a rope, of silver through the foliage. She ate rice and lentils from a tin cup and recorded herself describing the forest as dense, alive, almost too alive. She mentioned fireflies moving in lines that looked organized rather than random, glowing threads shifting between the trees. She stopped recording abruptly, and when she resumed, her voice had dropped. "There's a symbol carved into a trunk just below camp," she said. "Circle, 3 notches inward. Looks like what the shopkeeper back in town described. I'll document it in the morning. I don't like the way it's facing the tent." The next day, her notebook grew more erratic. She wrote less about flora and fauna and more about impressions. A faint smell of smoke when no fire was near. The feeling of being guided by invisible lines. The way the air seemed heavier in some pockets than others. She sketched what looked like a lattice of branches pinned across a narrow path. The drawing matched the accounts later given by search teams. Structures that looked like traps, but built without the mechanics of a snare. They were not designed to catch. They were designed to direct. In her recordings that afternoon, she spoke less as a scientist and more as a witness. She described hearing voices that were not voices. Syllables broken and stretched until they resembled birdsong, but layered in patterns too precise to be chance. She whispered into the microphone, "It feels like the forest is speaking back. Not to me, to itself, and I'm in the way of the conversation." At sunset, she reached a basin where roots grew in such density they formed walls taller than her head. The air was damp and close, carrying the smell of wet stone. She described finding ash on the ground, arranged not in a pile, but in a perfect ring, the same shape as the symbol painted on the trees. Her photo showed her boot next to it for scale. In the image, the ash is pale against the dark soil, and a single feather rests at the center as if placed there. She said in her note, "This was deliberate. Someone left this. I don't know if it's meant as a warning or a welcome." That night, she did not sleep. The audio captures her breathing, then sudden bursts of silence when she holds the recorder out. At one point, she says, "There's something moving around the tent. It's not an animal. It doesn't sound like 4 legs. It's pacing. Slow." Minutes later, her voice is steadier. "I'm going to unzip and look. If this is the last thing, it should be on record." The sound of the zipper begins. Then the recording ends. By the morning, her notes are scattered, half-sentences cut short. Found another circle, smaller. Inside it, stones stacked. Then, branches bent above me into an arch. Looks like an entrance. Then a single line. "I should not be here." In the final entry before her disappearance, Emily's handwriting slants across the page. There is a doorway. Not built, grown, roots twisted together into a shape that looks too perfect to be an accident. On the other side, the air is darker. I think something is waiting there, watching. The recording of that moment survives. Only in fragments, but her voice is clear enough in one line. "The forbidden jungle isn't empty. It's occupied, and it knows I'm here." When investigators reconstructed the hours leading to Emily's disappearance, they pieced together fragments from her damaged audio files, the torn pages of her notebook, and testimonies of those who saw her last. The picture they built was neither clean nor complete. It was a story with missing frames, as though the jungle itself had edited what could be known. On the morning of her final day inside, Emily's notes were sparse, written with an urgency that suggested movement rather than reflection. One page carried only 3 words, "Symbols getting closer." Another contained a rough sketch of concentric circles, layered over one another until they resembled ripples spreading from a single drop. Below it, she had scribbled, "Not natural." Her final audio file began with the rustle of leaves and the sound of shallow breathing. She spoke softly, as though afraid of being overheard. "The forest isn't just leading me somewhere," she whispered. "It's closing around me. The markers aren't behind me anymore. They've moved ahead. Someone is replacing them while I walk." She paused, then added, "I should turn back. I want to. But every time I try, the way out feels like it collapses. The jungle wants me deeper." By midday, the search logs suggest she had reached the innermost basin, a depression where streams disappeared into the earth and re-emerged elsewhere with no logic the maps could predict. Locals had long said this was the core of La Selva Prohibida, a place where sound bent, where compasses failed, and where no one should linger after nightfall. Her last known photograph was taken there. It shows the dense weave of roots rising into an archway that looks alarmingly architectural, though clearly grown, not built. The roots twist into one another like braided muscle, forming what resembles a doorway tall enough for a person to walk through. Beyond it, the space is black. No sunlight penetrates. No foliage is visible. Just a dark mouth waiting. The final audio fragment begins here. Emily's voice is steady at first, though the tremor beneath it betrays her. "This is the door," she says. "Not man-made, not chance. It was grown like this. I think it's been here for longer than we've been keeping track of anything." She pauses. Leaves crackle. Something's on the other side. I can feel it watching. For a moment, the recording fills with a low hum. Technicians who, later, analyzed the file, debated whether it was interference, wind, or something stranger. It pulses rhythmically, like breath amplified through a hollow chamber. Emily inhales sharply. Her final words are almost inaudible. "If I don't come back, tell them. It wasn't empty." The file ends abruptly, mid-syllable, with no sound of struggle, no scream, no impact. Just silence, as if the recorder itself had been swallowed. When she failed to meet Julio's cousin at the pickup point, the search began. For 3 days, teams combed the trail she was believed to have taken. They found some of her tape markers, but not in the order she had left them. Several strips had been tied higher than her reach, knotted in patterns unfamiliar to searchers. Her tent was never recovered. Her cooking pot, however, was found placed upright beneath a tree, its lid bound tightly with woven vines, though it was perfectly clean inside. Her pack was missing. A single boot print was discovered near a stream, followed by nothing. One ranger later testified it was like she had walked into a wall of trees and simply dissolved. No drag marks, no sign of a fall. The forest just closed over her. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she had stumbled upon an uncontacted tribe that enforced its secrecy without mercy. Others claimed she had found something older than people, something the forest itself had grown to defend. Villagers whispered that the doorway of roots was not a symbol, but a threshold, one that never allowed anyone who crossed it to return. Officially, her case remains unsolved. The Peruvian government filed it as a disappearance in restricted territory. Her family held a memorial in Oregon with no body, only her notebooks and a small collection of photographs returned from the search. But among those who knew her, the last line she spoke became a refrain. It wasn't empty. The forbidden jungle had taken her, as it had taken others before. What waited beyond the doorway remains unseen, but the silence she left behind is louder than any scream. The search for Emily Carter did not begin with urgency, but with an assumption of delay. When she missed her scheduled rendezvous on the riverbank, Julio's cousin waited for hours before raising an alarm. Travelers in the jungle often miscalculate timing. Trails collapse, weather stalls progress, batteries die. But by the second day, when the pickup point was still empty, the sense of something more permanent settled over the small community that had watched her leave. The initial search was local and modest. 2 guides, both familiar with the tributary, pushed their canoe upriver and scanned the banks. They called her name into the canopy, waited, then listened for movement. The forest answered with parrots, monkeys, and the hum of insects, but no human voice. They found one of her orange tape markers tied to a tree limb low enough for a child to touch, but it was knotted in a style neither of them recognized. That detail they kept to themselves until later. By the 3rd day, the search expanded. Rangers from the regional office arrived with radios, machetes, and notebooks already damp from humidity. They divided into teams of 3 and began cutting corridors into the brush, their blades leaving raw scars that would heal in weeks but felt immediately, erased by the density of green. They carried GPS units that showed their progress as digital lines, but those lines did not always match what their eyes confirmed. Paths that looked straight on a screen looped back in on themselves. Bearings tilted without warning. Several times the searchers found their own footprints returning toward them in patterns that made no geographic sense. Dogs were brought in on the 4th day. Trained to track human scent, they behaved erratically in the basin where Emily's last photograph had been taken. One dog barked toward the archway of roots, then sat down and refused to move forward, trembling despite its handler's coaxing. Another circled the same area repeatedly, as if caught in a loop, then lay down in the ash ring left behind by some earlier hand. The handlers pulled them away, shaken. The official logs from that week are clinical. Temperatures, humidity, rainfall, distances walked, number of hours spent searching. But the testimonies given privately tell another story. Volunteers spoke of hearing Emily's voice whispering in the undergrowth, though no recording device confirmed it. One ranger swore he heard her call his name, a name she could not have known. Another said the jungle grew suddenly still around dusk, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. By the end of the first week, frustration began to fray discipline. Teams argued over whether to push deeper or retreat. One volunteer quit abruptly after discovering a small lattice of sticks built across a trail he had cleared only hours earlier. He described it as not a trap, not random, a sign placed for us or against us. When pressed for detail, he would only repeat that it had been tied with a knot, older than anything he knew. The search was not without cost. A young ranger cut his hand deeply on a machete after slipping on roots. Near the river, the wound festered quickly in the damp heat, and he was evacuated on the 7th day. Another volunteer collapsed from dehydration and heat stroke, carried out unconscious by his companions. The jungle extracted its tax for every hour they spent within it. By the second week, the Peruvian government sent a larger team equipped with drones and thermal imaging. The drones provided aerial footage of clearings and canopy breaks, but when ground teams attempted to locate those same sites, they found only dense growth, unbroken by light. Thermal scans picked up heat signatures that resembled human forms, small clusters moving along ridges, but when approached, nothing remained but trees. Officials later attributed these anomalies to monkeys or technical interference. Those who were there remain unconvinced. Stories multiplied in the village during this time. One fisherman claimed he saw the official search was scaled down on the 15th day. Supplies had run thin, and commanders feared further loss. The final report closed with the sterile phrase, "Subject presumed deceased, cause undetermined, body unrecovered." But no, one who had stepped into the jungle believed the matter was closed. Months later, during the dry season, a second effort was launched quietly, this time with fewer people and less publicity. It was during this sweep that a fisherman uncovered a fragment of Emily's recorder wedged beneath a root system. The device was damaged, its casing warped by water and time, but inside remained one final clip. Barely 10 seconds long, it carried the sound of heavy rain, muffled breathing, and a single word repeated twice: waiting. That word deepened the mystery rather than resolved it. Waiting for what? Waiting for whom? Some interpreted it as Emily's acknowledgement that she had reached the threshold of something alive, something patient. Others dismissed it as the fragment of a longer sentence we could never reconstruct. In the wake of her disappearance, debates ignited across journals and news outlets. Was Emily reckless for entering a forbidden zone against local advice, or was she courageous for pursuing a story others had avoided? Anthropologists emphasized the possibility of uncontacted tribes enforcing their secrecy. Conservationists argued that her death highlighted the need to protect such territories from outsiders entirely. Sensationalists spun tales of jungle cults and supernatural guardians, feeding the internet's endless appetite for horror. For Emily's family, these arguments were meaningless. They held two memorials, one in the months after she vanished, and another a year later when the recorder fragment was returned to them. At the second service, her father spoke only one sentence. She went looking for a story, and the story kept her. In the villages near the jungle, her case became another thread in an older fabric of warnings. Elders pointed to her name as proof that the rules remained unchanged. Do not enter the forbidden places, because the forest has its own people, its own guardians, its own laws. Some said the archway of roots still stood, shifting from basin to basin, appearing to those who did not belong. Others claimed it was less a structure than an illusion, a living trick the jungle played to separate insiders from outsiders. The truth remains hidden, as it always has. Officially, Emily Carter is listed among the disappeared. Unofficially, her story lingers in whispers, in the caution of boat pilots who refuse to approach certain bends, in the way villagers lower their voices when outsiders ask about the forbidden jungle. Her last word, waiting, still hangs in the air like unfinished grammar. Waiting for the next traveler curious enough to follow her path. Waiting for the next threshold to open. Waiting for us to understand that some doors, once entered, do not lead back. Emily Carter entered the forbidden jungle, and she never returned.